Yuk A Tsutat. Kunishchish for listening to me today, and good morning. I say good morning because I still have much to learn about Tlingit. Wushkatan tus hit akwan dakanach dach. My family is of the Eagle Wolf Moeties of the Wushkatan Akwan tus hit Shark House, and we are originally from Auk Bay near Juneau, Alaska. Kiskla Yohat Duasak. My name is Mariah, and I'm a fourth-year communication major in ethnic studies and Native American and Indigenous studies minors at the University of California, San Diego. Today, I'm going to talk to y'all about decolonization, and I like to call this lesson a brief anti-history because there are a lot of truths that have purposely been ignored by most schools. When I graduated high school, I had no idea how much of the truth had been left out of our history textbooks. And without knowing the whole story about the founding of the United States of America, communities who have been constantly mistreated can never heal from generations of violent trauma. Decolonization is the physical process of redistributing all colonized land back to their original indigenous inhabitants, and therefore restoring all indigenous sovereignty over the land, like North America. This sentence may be confusing, so let's define some of these key words. Indigenous people are the First Nations of the Americas, and they consist of very diverse populations of people spreading from the southern tip of what's now called Brazil and the northern point of what's now considered Canada. These nations have stories of creation rather than declaration, and their identities are deeply rooted in their connections to the land, their ancestral land. Colonization occurs when one country invades another, usually with the promise of trade and religious freedom, to strip the quote-unquote newly discovered land of its resources. Starting in the 1400s, the European powers made it their divine missions to explore the world and spread the blessed word of Jesus. Settler colonialism occurs when the invaders remove the original inhabitants, the indigenous, resettle the now quote-unquote uninhabited land, and reproduce their own settler population and cultures. This is how America was actually born, not on the sole purpose of freedom, but on the backs of beaten African slaves and murdered indigenous people. Scholarly authors of color, Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang, explain in the introduction of Decolonization is Not a Metaphor that in the process of settler colonialism, land is remade into property and human relationships to land are restricted to the relationship of the owner to his property. This means that in our current mainstream American culture, everyone's relationship with the earth is one of ownership instead of community. In other words, no one likes to share the land they have forcibly taken. Colonial is the adjective form of colonization, describing things as a part of the colonizer's cultures, ideas, ways of life, and so on. White supremacy is the belief that white people are somehow inherently superior to all other races. It is an ideology that poisons societies with unwarranted hate based solely on the color of people's skin. Unfortunately, many people still subscribe to this idea, both consciously and subconsciously, creating toxic environments that are unsafe for communities of color. Oppression is the unfair treatment of people for a long period of time, often executed through various systems in a society based on differences in culture, race, class, gender, age, ability, and any other aspect of identity that one cannot control. And last but not least, Indigenous sovereignty. This is achieved when the independent governments of the First Nations, the very first occupants of this land, is allowed to once again govern itself. And under the current colonial state, Indigenous governments are continuously undermined, torn apart, and destroyed. But we persist. Without these definitions, I didn't understand what it truly meant to be Indigenous in a settler colonial society, especially one that is so proud of its declarations, forefathers, and amendments. My family's existence is an act of resistance as it directly challenges the authenticity of the colonizers' claims to this land, because dominant cultures continue to erase everything native. Indigenous erasure is an ongoing colonial project, because colonized countries like the United States can only exist if all the First Nations are no longer intact. therefore making the land free for the taking. Colonial societies, like America, further justify its existence through white supremacist ideas that suppress all communities that do not fit in the supposed norm. The dominating, violent white culture. Decolonization involves acts of direct resistance against the colonial state, like the revealing of the true history of America. In the introduction of Why Indigenous Literatures Matter, Indigenous writer Daniel Heath Justice argues we must honestly and clearly name that history before we can untangle the complications that different newcomer populations have brought into that relationship, or before we can look for alliances and connections between marginalized communities. To be marginalized is to be treated as lesser than, to be placed as less important, and to be pushed to the sidelines. In order for these communities to heal from years of intense and ongoing oppression and to take steps towards a unifying, decolonial process, we must first acknowledge the injustices, the unfairness that we need to fix. Thanks for listening, and if you have any questions, feel free to comment below.